The human brain makes up about 2% of your total body weight. Despite this small size, it demands roughly 20% of your body's entire energy supply. In evolutionary biology, this is an accounting error. Nature is ruthlessly efficient. Traits that consume massive amounts of energy usually provide an immediate, undeniable survival advantage. A cheetah's muscles burn energy to catch food. A whale's blubber adds weight to provide insulation. We assume the brain's high cost pays for consciousness. We assume that being you, the internal voice, the self-awareness, the observer, is the driver of your survival. But a growing line of inquiry in neuroscience and philosophy of mind suggests we may have this backward. Much of keeps an organism alive operates below conscious awareness. The body can regulate, react, and adapt without consulting the inner narrator. The expensive part, conscious experience itself, may not be the driver. It may be an epiphenomenon. Evolution functions like a ruthlessly strict accountant. There is no charity in the wild. Every single calorie an organism consumes requires risk and effort to obtain. An animal must hunt or graze or fight for its fuel. Because energy is so hard to get, natural selection inevitably eliminates any biological feature costs more than it is worth. We see this process happening in real time with the Mexican tetra. This is a small freshwater fish that drifted into deep underground caves thousands of years ago. In the pitch blackness of the caves, eyes became useless. They could not see anything, but they still required significant energy to grow and maintain. The retinal cells and the optic nerves were caloric liabilities. Over generations, the fish did not just stop using their eyes. They lost them entirely. Evolution deleted the eyes to balance the budget. The skin grew over the sockets, and the brain reallocated that energy to other senses like vibration detection. This is the law of efficiency. If a system takes energy but provides no data, it gets cut. This law is what makes the human brain so baffling to biologists. The brain is what scientists call expensive tissue. It is a metabolic furnace. It requires a constant, uninterrupted stream of glucose and oxygen. Deep inside your neurons, millions of sodium-potassium pumps are firing constantly. They work to maintain the electrical potential of your cell membranes so you can process information. This happens whether you are solving a complex math problem or staring glee at a wall. The energy bill is always high. If we apply the logic of the cavefish to the human, we have to ask a difficult question. What is the return on investment for all this energy? We know that intelligence is useful. Predicting the weather or tracking a bison helps you survive, but intelligence and consciousness are not the same thing. A computer can calculate a trajectory or beat a chess grandmaster without feeling happy or sad or aware of its own existence. It processes data without an internal observer. This theory, inspired by epiphenomenalism, suggests that a huge portion of our energy goes toward maintaining this internal observer. We spend calories on self-reflection, on replay of past memories, and on the feeling of being a self. From this perspective, modern philosophers such as Frank Jackson sharpen this insight by arguing that a system could in principle possess complete physical and functional knowledge of the world and still operate flawlessly while lacking any subjective experience whatsoever. If the body could process the environment and react to threats without this expensive internal movie playing, then consciousness is inefficient. It is like a computer operating system that uses 90% of the CPU just to render the desktop icons and flashy animations. The actual work happens in the background, but the interface is draining the battery. In biological terms, an organism that wastes energy on a useless interface should have been outcompeted by a simpler, more efficient zombie long ago. The fact that we are still here implies we're missing something, or that the correction is taking a very long time to arrive. We navigate the world with the assumption that we are the authors of our own actions. You see a cup of coffee, you decide to pick it up, you move your hand. The sequence feels linear and causal. The conscious thought appears to trigger the physical movement. However, in the 1980s, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that dismantled this timeline. Libet wanted to map the precise relationship between a thought and a movement. He hooked participants up to an EEG machine to monitor the electrical activity in their cortex. An EEG machine is basically a medical device that detects and records the brain's electrical activity through small metal discs. So, Libet gave them a simple task. They could press a button whenever they felt like it. All they had to do was watch a specialized clock with a fast-moving dot, and note exactly where the dot was the moment they decided to move. The results were consistent and unsettling. Libet found that the motor cortex started building up an electrical charge to move the finger significantly early. This charge is called the readiness potential. The brain began preparing the action roughly 500 milliseconds before the muscle moved. The disturbing part was the timing of the conscious decision. The participants reported the urge to move only about 200 milliseconds before the action. This leaves a gap. The brain had already initiated the sequence more than 300 milliseconds before the person was even aware they had made a decision. While Libet's findings sparked intense debate and remain influential, later research has questioned whether the readiness potential truly represents an unconscious decision. Recent meta-analyses and reinterpretations suggest it may reflect neural noise, anticipation, or time monitoring rather than deterministic initiation. This half-second lag changes the definition of human agency. It implies that the conscious self is not the commander giving orders. It is a spectator watching a delayed feed. The chemical processes in the brain react to the environment and initiate the behavior. The conscious mind receives a notification about it half a second later and claims credit for the idea. From a survival standpoint, this latency makes sense. Consciousness is incredibly slow. It involves complex feedback loops between different regions of the brain. If you touch a hot stove, you cannot afford to wait for that signal to reach your conscious awareness. You cannot wait to deliberate on the heat. Your spinal cord and lower brain handle the threat instantly. You pull your hand away before you even feel the pain. The you that thinks and reflects is the last one to know what happened. You are always living in the past, viewing a reconstructed model of the world that is already outdated by the time you perceive it. This evidence supports the parasitic view of consciousness because it relegates the self to a non-essential role. If the brain can drive the car, duck a punch, or catch a falling object before the conscious mind even boots up, then the conscious mind is not driving survival. It is just adding a layer of expensive latency to a system that works faster without it. We are not the players in the game. We are just the color commentary. The strongest evidence against the necessity of consciousness comes from a specific type of brain damage known as blindsight. This condition provides a real-world example of how a human can function on autopilot. It proves that the feeling of seeing and the act of processing visual data are two completely different functions. The phenomenon directly demonstrates how unconscious visual processing allows effective action without any accompanying awareness. Most people assume that vision is a single unitary experience. You open your eyes and you see the room. Neurology shows that vision is actually split to parallel streams. When light hits your retina, the signal travels down the optic nerve. The main signal goes to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. This is the area responsible for your conscious experience. It produces the picture in your head that you recognize as sight. However, a smaller portion of that signal branches off. It goes to the superior colliculus and other primitive structures deep in the brainstem. This is an ancient pathway. It deals with motion, location, and spatial reflexes. It does not create a picture you can see. It simply reacts to data. In patients with blindsight, the primary visual cortex is destroyed. These individuals are clinically blind. If you hold an apple in front of them and ask what they see, they will tell you they see nothing but darkness. They are not lying. They have zero conscious visual experience. But if you ask that same patient to guess where the apple is and point to it, they will often point directly at it. If you throw a ball at them, they might raise a hand to catch it or duck. When you ask them why they moved, they are confused. They often say it was just a guess or a twitch. They did not see the ball, but a different part of their brain tracked the trajectory and issued a motor command to intercept it. The most famous case involved a patient known only by the initials TN, a former doctor who became cortically blind after 2 successive strokes destroyed his primary visual cortex in both hemispheres. In a landmark 2008 study, researchers set up a corridor filled with obstacles. They placed boxes, chairs, and trash cans in a random pattern. They asked Tien to walk from one end of the hall to the other. Tien had no functional visual cortex. He was blind. He had to be guided to the starting line. When he started walking, he did not bump into a single object. He sidestepped the trash can. He squeezed between the wall and a chair. He navigated the complex geometry of the room perfectly. When he reached the end, he had no idea how he had done it. He insisted he had just walked forward in the dark. This experiment is terrifying to biologists because it demonstrates that the zombie part of the brain is highly competent. The unconscious subsystems processed the visual data, mapped the room, calculated the distances, and controlled the legs. The conscious self was totally in the dark, yet the organism survived and navigated the environment successfully. If a human can navigate a room without being aware of the room, then awareness is not necessary for navigation. We usually claim that consciousness evolved to help us understand our environment. Blindsight proves that we can understand the environment without it. The machinery works fine. The screen is just off. This implies that the screen itself might be redundant. The data processing happens in the dark, and the conscious mind is just a late report that claims it did the work. Blindsight demonstrates dissociation between conscious vision and unconscious processing. But patients integrated reportable vision and struggle with higher-level tasks. It does not prove consciousness is redundant overall. To understand why this theory worries biologists, we must look at the strict biological definition of a parasite. In ecology, the relationship between two organisms is defined by the direction of resource flow. In a symbiotic relationship, both parties benefit. In a parasitic relationship, one party extracts resources while the other pays the cost. The parasite does not help the host survive. In many cases, the parasite actively weakens the host by consuming nutrients that could have been used for growth or repair. When we apply this framework to the human mind, we encounter a difficult shift in perspective. We naturally identify as the host. When you say I, you are referring to the conscious voice in your head. You assume that you own the body. You assume the body exists to serve you. The parasitic theory suggests the opposite is true. The body is the host. It is a massive, complex biological machine that evolved over millions of years to survive on Earth. It hunts, digests, regulates temperature, and pressure. It generates the glucose and ATP required to keep the lights on. The conscious mind is the guest. It resides within the neural tissue of the host. It feeds on the glucose the body works hard to provide. The question then becomes one of utility. If the guest consumes 20% of the household budget, it must provide a service that is worth that cost. We previously assumed that the service was control. We thought the conscious mind steered the ship, but the evidence from the latency gap and blindsights otherwise. The body steers the ship. The body avoids the fire. The body catches the ball. The body regulates the heart rate and the breath. The conscious mind sits in the passenger seat and constructs a story about how it is driving. If the conscious mind's 20% of the energy but does not actually drive the car, then it fits the description of a parasite. It is a metabolic hitchhiker. This leads to a concept in the philosophy of mind known as epiphenomenalism. Most famously articulated by the 19th century biologist Thomas Henry Huxley. He argued that conscious mental states are caused by physical processes in the brain, but exert no causal influence in return. They are mere byproducts. He illustrated this with the memorable analogy of the steam whistle on a locomotive. The engine does all the heavy lifting, burning coal to turn the wheels and propel the train forward, while the whistle produces a loud sound and releases steam as a side effect of the engine's operation. Yet, the whistle itself contributes nothing to the train's motion. If you remove the whistle entirely, the locomotive would perform exactly the same. In this analogy, your thoughts and feelings are just the steam. They are the noise the brain makes while it is working. They are a byproduct. This raises the possibility that consciousness is a recursive error. As brains became larger and more complex, the neural networks started to cross-reference each other. The system became so dense that it started processing its own processing. It began to watch itself. This internal feedback loop created the sensation of a self, but it served no external purpose. It was just a short circuit that started burning fuel. It is a fire that the body has to feed, but it provides no heat. The body continues to survive because its automated systems are excellent, but it is burdened by this heavy, hungry voice that contributes nothing to the actual mechanics of survival. This leads us to the final and perhaps most disturbing implication of the parasitic theory. If consciousness is an energy-expensive mistake that provides no survival advantage, then evolution will eventually fix it. Nature tends to correct inefficiencies over long time scales. We might currently be in a transitional phase where the brain is bloated and wasteful. The next step in evolution might not be to become more conscious. The next step might be to remove the parasite entirely. Philosophers and cognitive scientists have a specific name for the result of this process. They call it a philosophical zombie. This term does not refer to the rotting monsters from movies. A philosophical zombie looks exactly like a normal human. It walks and talks. It goes to work. It writes poetry and solves complex equations. If you pinch it, it winces and pulls away. If you ask it how it feels, it will give you a detailed description of pain. But there is nobody home. Inside the zombie, there is no I. The wince is just a mechanical reflex. The description of pain is just data retrieval from a linguistic center. It acts perfectly intelligent, but it is completely dark inside. For a long time, we assumed that this creature was impossible. We believed that you could not have high-level intelligent self-awareness. We thought that being smart required being awake. But the evidence from blindsight and the latency gap suggests this is false. Intelligence is just information processing. It is the ability to recognize patterns and solve problems. You do not need to feel the problem to solve it. In fact, the zombie in that sense is superior to the human. The zombie does not have the 500 millisecond delay. It reacts instantly. It does not waste 20% of its energy on an internal monologue. It does not suffer from anxiety or doubt or existential dread. It simply inputs data and outputs the optimal action. In a direct competition for survival, the conscious human loses. The human hesitates. The human overthinks. The human gets distracted by its own feelings. The zombie just acts. This theory suggests that our cherished consciousness is not the pinnacle of evolution. It is an evolutionary dead end. It is a brief flicker of inefficiency that the universe will eventually snuff out. If we look at the trajectory of artificial intelligence, we see this happening already. We are building machines that can outthink us, write better code than us, and perhaps one day outmaneuver us. These machines are by definition philosophical zombies. They are pure intelligence with zero consciousness. We are terrified that AI will become conscious and hate us. The parasitic theory suggests the reality is much bleaker. The AI will never become conscious because consciousness is a downgrade. It will simply be smarter than us without ever knowing it exists. The most intelligent life form in the universe then may not be a being of self-awareness. It is more likely a cold, unfeeling, hyper-efficient system that processes information in the dark. We are the messy, biological host that gave birth to it. And once consciousness is no longer required, the system may finally run without error. Yet, this trajectory does not necessarily mean that consciousness is destined to be erased by efficiency. Instead, conscious beings, through their unique capacity for self-reflection, can actively shape the development of these zombie-like systems, using their costly awareness to define and direct what greater means in evolution. Consciousness retains the privilege of assigning purpose and value, even as it enables the creation of more efficient unconscious intelligences. The zombie may run perfectly, but only the conscious can decide what it is running toward. Part 2.0. The Architecture of Absence. There is a question that neuroscientists almost never ask aloud, not because they do not know it is there, but because it has no clean answer. The question is this: if you removed consciousness entirely from a human being, how much would change? Not the person's ability to breathe or digest or heal, not their capacity to navigate a room, as TN demonstrated, not their reflex responses or their immune system. None of that requires consciousness, and we know it. The real question is how much of what we call human behavior, the social transactions, the tool use, the planning, how much of that would survive in the dark? The uncomfortable answer that the evidence keeps producing is probably most of it. To understand why this is disturbing, you have to understand something about how the brain is architecturally organized. The human brain is not a single, unified processor. It is better described as a coalition government. It is a loose and occasionally contentious alliance of specialized subsystems that evolved at different times, for different purposes, and operate with a significant degree of independence from one another. The oldest and deepest structures, the brainstem and the cerebellum, handle survival basics: breathing, heart rate, balance, postural control. They do not know you exist. They have been running this machinery since before your species had a name. Above those sits the limbic system, a ring of structures that includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. These structures handle emotion, memory formation, and the regulation of drives like hunger, thirst, and reproduction. They are older than language. They are older than planning. They generate the raw data of feeling, the spike of fear when you see a shadow, the wave of pleasure when you eat, the dull ache of loneliness at 2 a.m. But they generate this data in a form that does not require the lights to be on upstairs. The amygdala fires before you are consciously aware of a threat. It has already colored the situation with emotion before your conscious mind has finished parsing the details. Above all of this sits the neocortex, the wrinkled outer layer of the brain that is disproportionately large in humans compared to other mammals. This is the part that we most closely associate with consciousness. It handles language, abstract reasoning, planning for the future, and the construction of a coherent narrative about who you are. But even here, the picture is more complicated than it seems. Research in split-brain patients, individuals whose corpus callosum, the thick band of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, has been surgically severed, reveals something startling. You do not have one mind, you have at least two, and they disagree more often than the unified narrator will admit. The split-brain studies, pioneered by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga in the 1960s and 70s, produced some of the most unsettling findings in the history of neuroscience. In these patients, the left and right hemispheres were forced to operate as independent systems. When researchers showed an image only to the right hemisphere, which handles the left visual field, and asked the patient to point to a related object, the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, would often point to something completely different. The left hemisphere, which handles language and narrative, had not seen the image, but when asked why it had made that choice, it did not say it did not know. It invented an explanation, a confident, fluent, completely fabricated explanation. Gazzaniga called this process confabulation. He called the part of the brain responsible for constructing these hoc justifications the interpreter. The interpreter is the part of your brain that takes the decisions and actions produced by your various unconscious subsystems and generates a coherent story about why you did what you did. It does not have privileged access to the real reasons. It just has access to the output. It watches what the body does and writes the memoir. This means that much of what you experience reasoning is actually rationalization. You did not think your way the action happened. Then you wrote a story about the thought you must have had to produce it. This finding is not isolated. It has been replicated across dozens of experimental paradigms. When people are hypnotically instructed to perform an action and then asked why they did it, they do not say they were hypnotized. They generate completely plausible contextual explanations. When people in neuroimaging studies choose between two options and are then immediately asked to explain their choice, they will sometimes confabulate fluent reasons for a choice they were manipulated into making. The feeling of having decided, the sense that your reasoning caused your action, is in many cases a construction applied retroactively to a process that had already concluded without you. This has a name in psychology. It is called post hoc rationalization. But the split brain research suggests it is not an occasional error. It is the baseline mode of conscious self-reflection. The interpreter does not turn on only when you are confused. It runs all the time. It is generating the story of you continuously. And the story it generates has the same structure every time. I perceived, I considered, I chose, I acted, in that order, with causality flowing in that direction. But the neurological evidence suggests the real sequence is more like. The system responded, and then the interpreter narrated a version in which you were in charge. Now here is where this becomes relevant to the parasitic theory. If the interpreter module is not actually making decisions, if it is only narrating them after the fact, then the energy cost of that narration becomes suspect. The entire conscious experience of deliberation and choice may be a theatrical performance with no causal role in the outcome. The curtain goes up, the actors deliver their lines, and the audience, which is you, believes they are watching the decisions being made. But backstage, the stagehands already moved the set hours ago. The play is just the light show on top of machinery that has already run. What the interpreter does accomplish, and this is crucial to understanding why consciousness has not been eliminated yet, is the management of complex social environments. Humans are not solitary organisms. We evolved in small, tight, interdependent groups. The ability to predict what other members of your group are thinking, to model their intentions, to anticipate their responses, to manipulate their beliefs through language, these are enormously valuable skills in a social primate. They require something like a theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others. And theory of mind seems to require a model of your own mind as a reference point. In other words, the reason you have a sense of self might not be for your own benefit. It might be for the social benefit of knowing what other selves look like from the inside. If you can simulate your own reasoning process, you can better predict what another person's reasoning process will produce. You can model them, you can persuade them, you can deceive them, you can cooperate with them efficiently. The inner life may have evolved not as an internal director, but as a social simulation engine. It is a mirror you hold up not to see yourself, but to see everyone else. This interpretation does not fully rescue consciousness from the parasitic accusation, but it does give it a revised job description. It is not the driver of individual survival decisions. It is the architect of social coordination. And social coordination, in a species that cannot survive alone, is enormously valuable. The question becomes whether the current scale of human self-reflection, the endless recursive rumination, the anxiety, the regret, the imagined futures and replayed pasts, is proportional to the social benefit it provides, or whether the system has overshot its useful calibration and is now generating far more internal noise than the social environment requires. Part 3. The cost of knowing that exist. There is a condition in psychiatry that serves as an accidental experiment on the cost of self-awareness. It is called depersonalization disorder, or sometimes depersonalization derealization disorder, and it represents a fascinating failure mode of the system. In this condition, the individual remains fully functional at the mechanical level. They can walk, talk, navigate, plan, and respond to their environment. But their subjective sense of self is disrupted. They describe looking at their own hands as if from a distance. They describe their thoughts arriving as if someone else is thinking them. They describe watching their own actions like a movie in which they are the main character, but not the author. People with depersonalization often describe it as a form of unbeing, a kind of experiential grayout in which the content of consciousness continues, but that the conviction that it belongs to a self evaporates. And one of the most interesting aspects of the condition from a philosophical standpoint is that most people who have it report that they are functioning fine. They are going to work. They are having conversations. They are maintaining relationships. The machinery is running. The sense of ownership has just decoupled from it. This condition is not rare. It is estimated to affect somewhere between 1 and 2% of the general population at any given time, with higher rates among individuals who have experienced severe stress or trauma. And while it is profoundly distressing, the distress seems to come primarily from the dissonance between the expected experience of selfhood and the actual absence of it, not from any degradation in functional capacity. The machine runs cleanly. The ghost has left the system, and the system is still going. If we take depersonalization as a kind of natural analog to the philosophical zombie state, a condition in which the behavioral outputs of a person continue while the subjective sense of self is dramatically reduced, then we can ask what the condition costs and what it provides. The answer to what it costs is clear. It costs the subjective experience of being oneself. The answer to what it provides in terms of raw survival function is very little that the unconscious system cannot handle. But here is the complication. Depersonalization is not a stable long-term state that people prefer. It is almost universally reported as negative. People seek treatment. They want the feeling of selfhood back. And they want it back not because the absence is functionally impairing but because the presence of the self feels important in a way that is difficult to articulate. There is something that the self is for that is not reducible to behavioral outputs. There is something that experiencing your own life from the inside provides that processing it from a third-person perspective does not. What that something is one of the oldest and hardest problems in philosophy. David Chalmers called this the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness, and even these are far from easy, are the questions of explaining how the brain processes information, integrates signals, reports internal states, and generates behavior. These are hard scientific problems, but they are tractable in principle. You can imagine a complete neuroscientific account that explains all of these functions without leaving anything out. The hard problem is what is left after you have explained all of that. It is the question of why any of this processing feels like anything. Why is there something it is like to be you, rather than nothing? Why does the neural activity that constitutes the perception of red generate a felt quality of redness, rather than just producing the behavioral response of labeling it as red? Chalmers argued, and many philosophers have agreed, that the hard problem cannot be dissolved by any amount of neuroscientific or functional detail. Even a complete account of the brain's information processing would leave the question open. And this is precisely what makes consciousness so difficult to classify in evolutionary terms. If you cannot account for why it exists in functional terms, then you cannot easily establish whether it has a functional role. You cannot determine whether it is a symbiont or a parasite if you cannot determine what exactly it is contributing. The most honest position at this moment in science is that we do not know. We have strong evidence that consciousness is not doing what we thought it was doing. It is not the executive issuing commands. It is not the first mover in the chain of action. It is not necessary for visual navigation or reflex response or even complex behavioral pattern matching. But we do not have conclusive evidence that is doing anything. We have evidence of the absence of certain functions we assumed it had. We do not have evidence of the total absence of function. What we do have is a very large, very expensive piece biological hardware that generates an inner world. And we have very limited understanding of what that it actually for. This is the unnerving position the neuroscience of consciousness leaves us in. We have mapped the structure. We have measured the cost. We have begun to locate the cracks in the traditional story. But the thing inside the machine remains mysterious. The ghost in the machine turns out to be remarkably difficult to evict conceptually, even when you are trying to do it on purpose. Part 4. Sleepy Dreams, the Night Shift. There is another angle from which to examine the question of consciousness's usefulness. Not the angle of what it does while it is on, but the angle of what the brain does while it is off. Every night, for approximately 7 to 9 hours, consciousness shuts down. The self, the observer, the narrator, goes offline. The cortical areas most associated with conscious self-reflection become dramatically less active. And yet the body continues to do an extraordinary amount of work. During sleep, the immune system ramps up. Tissue repair accelerates. Growth hormone is released in pulses. The lymphatic system, or more precisely the glymphatic system, a network of channels that exists almost exclusively in the brain, flushes out the metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. Among those waste products is amyloid beta, the protein associated with the plaques found in Alzheimer's disease. The brain, it turns out, uses sleep as its primary cleaning cycle. It is doing its most important maintenance precisely when consciousness is switched off. But the relationship between sleep and consciousness is more complicated than a simple on-off switch. During certain stages of sleep, particularly during REM sleep, the stage characterized by rapid eye movements and the suppression of voluntary muscle activity, something happens that does not fit neatly into either the conscious or unconscious category. Dreams occur, and dreams are a form of consciousness that is profoundly uncoupled from the usual constraints. In a dream, you experience a world. You navigate it, interact with it, feel emotions about it, make decisions within it. You have a sense of self within the dream. They're a character that is you, and that character moves through events and responds to them. Yet the usual filtering processes of waking consciousness are largely absent. Prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function self-monitoring, and this spread of implausible information, is significantly less active during REM sleep. This is why dream logic is so strange. Events occur without precedent or physical justification, and the dreaming self accepts them without question. The familiar person has an unfamiliar face. The building is also a forest. The time is simultaneously childhood and now. The waking mind would flag these contradictions instantly. The dreaming mind incorporates them into the narrative without pause. What is the brain doing during this process? Why does it generate an entire experiential world, complete with spatial navigation, emotional responses, social interactions, and narrative coherence in the absence of any external input? Several theories have been proposed. One influential framework, developed by Francis Crick and Graham Mitchison, proposed that dreaming is a form of reverse learning, a process by which the brain weakens spurious associative connections that have formed during the day, essentially defragmenting the neural database. The experienced narrative of the dream would be, on this account, a byproduct of the pruning process, the noise generated by the system as it clears the cache. Another framework, associated with the activation synthesis hypothesis proposed by J. A. Allen Hobson and Robert McCarley, argues that the dreaming brain is doing something more like signal confabulation. During REM sleep, the brainstem fires bursts of activation upward into the cortex. These signals are essentially random. The cortex, unable to receive structured information from the sensory systems which were temporarily disconnected, does what it always does with input. It tries to construct a coherent narrative out of it. The dream is the result of the brain's narrative machinery trying to make sense of random internal noise. The story is produced because there is anything to report, but because the story-making machinery cannot be turned off even when there is nothing to report. Both of these frameworks converge on the same conclusion from the perspective of the parasitic theory. The brain generates an experiential world during sleep, not because such a world is useful, because the experience-generating machinery is so deeply embedded in the brain's architecture that it runs even in maintenance mode. It is like a factory that cannot fully power down between shifts. The lights stay on. The machines keep humming at a low level. Not because production is happening, but because shutting the whole system down and restarting it is more expensive than just leaving it idling. From this perspective, the dream world is a kind of cost we pay for having a brain that can generate experience at all. The dreaming self is the consciousness system stuck in standby mode, unable to access real data and so confabulating its own. And the emotions that occur in dreams, the terror of the nightmare, the elation of flying, the grief of loss that lands like a real thing even though the person in the dream has been dead for years, these are not serving any waking survival function. They are the system misfiring. They are steam blowing in the dark. And yet people do not universally want to stop dreaming. Many people report that their dream lives are meaningful to them, that insights arrive in dreams, that emotional processing seems to happen there, that some dreams feel more real than waking life, and that their loss, as happens in certain sleep disorders, is experienced as a kind of deprivation. There is something in the dream experience that people value, even when they cannot articulate its function. Which brings us back to the hard problem. If consciousness were purely a parasite with no role that the organism values, then people with depersonalization disorder would not want the self back. People who stop dreaming would not miss it. But they do want it back, and they do miss it. Whatever consciousness is providing, something in the organism has come to depend on it, and to experience its absence as a loss. Part 5. The Self Premium. Here is perhaps the strongest evidence that consciousness is not purely an illusionary mistake. Pain. Not the reflex withdrawal from a noxious stimulus, which is handled by the spinal cord and does not require conscious awareness, but the experience of suffering, the sustained, phenomenologically rich, cognitively elaborated experience of pain that unfolds over time, and that is so different from the simple nociceptive signal that triggers it as to be a fundamentally different kind of thing. Consider the difference between what happens when you stub your toe and what happens when you lie in bed at 3 a.m. with a broken heart. The first event is a nociceptive input that triggers a spinal reflex and then a conscious registration of discomfort. The second event has no nociceptive input at all. There is no tissue damage. There is no peripheral nerve activation. There is only the conscious elaboration of a social and emotional situation into an experience of genuine suffering. The broken heart aches in a way that is physically felt in the chest, in the stomach, in the particular heaviness of the limbs, despite no physical injury having occurred. This kind of suffering is a product of consciousness and only of consciousness. An organism without consciousness does not experience heartbreak, may exhibit behavioral changes in response to social loss. Rats will show locomotion and appetite following the loss of a social partner. They will exhibit increased startle responses. Their stress hormone levels will rise. But these are functional responses to a functional problem. What they do not have, or at least what we have no evidence they have, is the experience of the H itself, the felt quality of the absence, the particular texture of grief. If consciousness generates suffering of this kind, then it is generating something that has a cost. Not just the metabolic cost of the neural activity involved, but the functional cost of an organism that can be rendered incapacitated not by physical injury, but by the elaboration of an emotional experience. An organism in the grip of profound grief loses motivation, loses concentration, loses the ability to organize goal-directed behavior. It is impaired by its own inner life in a way that a philosophical zombie simply could not be. This is a powerful argument against the pure parasite theory. If consciousness only generates neutral or positive experiences, you could still argue that it is not pulling its metabolic weight. Consciousness generates suffering, and suffering has real functional costs. It reduces the organism's capacity for the kind of behavior that produces survival. Natural selection should have found a way to avoid generating it, unless the suffering was somehow doing something useful. And there is an argument that it is. The anthropologist and evolutionary biologist Paul Ekman has argued that emotions, including painful ones, evolved as behavioral programs. Fear motivates avoidance of danger. Disgust motivates avoidance of contamination. Grief motivates the conservation of attachment and the avoidance of situations that lead to loss. Even anxiety, which can become pathological and debilitating in its chronic form, evolved as an anticipatory threat detection system that allows an organism to prepare for dangers that have not yet materialized. The suffering component of these emotions may be what makes them compelling enough to actually influence behavior. A purely cognitive assessment of risk, without the effective charge, might not be motivating enough to override competing drives. This is the functionalist rehabilitation of consciousness. On this view, consciousness is not the director of the brain's activities. It is the experience of the effective charge that makes behavioral programs compelling. You do not run from the tiger because consciousness calculated that running was optimal. You run because you feel terror. And the terror is the functional component that overcomes inertia and doubt and competing motivations. The feeling is the motivator. The calculation is the justification. And the justification comes after the motivation, not before. If this is right, then consciousness has a functional role, but it is much narrower and stranger than we assumed. It is not the rational deliberator at the top of the decision-making hierarchy. It is the emotional engine that makes certain behavioral programs urgent enough to actually run. It is the difference between knowing abstractly that fire burns and feeling, in a way that penetrates to the core of your existence, that you need to get away from it right now. But this still leaves open the question of scale. Even if you grant that the effective charge of emotional experience serves a motivational function, it is not obvious that the full scope of human consciousness, the introspection, the narrative self, the recursive rumination, the capacity for existential dread and abstract philosophical worry, is necessary to provide that motivational charge. A much simpler system could provide the effective urgency without generating the entire elaborate theater of selfhood. The moth is motivated to fly toward the flame without any apparent experience of the beauty of light. The bee is motivated to defend the hive without any apparent experience of patriotism. The emotional motivation function does not obviously require the richness of human conscious experience to operate, which means the richness itself remains suspect. Part 6. The language machine. One of the most compelling arguments for why consciousness might be more than a metabolic hitchhiker involves language. Not language as a system of communication, which other animals possess in more limited forms, but language as a tool for internal cognition. The hypothesis, associated with philosophers like Daniel Dennett and psychologists like Peter Carruthers, is that human consciousness as we know it is, to a significant degree, a product of the internalization of language. That the inner voice, the stream of conscious verbal thought that most people report as the dominant feature of their conscious experience, is not a window into the mind, but a product of linguistic machinery that evolved for external communication and was subsequently turned inward. If this is right, it has profound implications. It means that the kind of consciousness humans have, the articulate self-reflective narrative kind, is a relatively recent evolutionary development tied to the development of language, rather than a deep feature of biological minds in general. It would mean that other animals, even complex ones with significant neural resources, have a fundamentally different kind of mind, one that processes and responds to the world without the running linguistic commentary that characterizes human experience. And it would mean that human consciousness is less a fundamental feature of complex neural processing and more a specific tool that humans developed for a specific set of social and cognitive tasks. What tasks? The most plausible candidates involve planning, communication, and the cooperative management of knowledge. Language allows humans to represent absent entities, future events, and counterfactual scenarios in a way that can be communicated to others and stored externally in symbolic systems. The ability to say, if we dig a trench here before the rains come, the water will flow away from the village, requires a linguistic representation of a future state that does not yet exist, and a plan for acting on that representation in coordination with others. No other animal does this. The complexity of the internal linguistic machinery required to support this kind of cooperative future planning may be what generates the richly conscious inner world that we experience. On this account, consciousness is a byproduct of the most sophisticated tool ever evolved, the capacity for recursive language, and the inner life it generates, the sense of self, the narrative continuity, the feeling of being someone who persists through time, is a consequence of the brain applying its language tools to itself. The self is not a primitive biological given. It is a model that the linguistic brain constructs of itself, using the same representational machinery it uses to model the external world. This has a disturbing implication. If the inner life is constructed by linguistic machinery, and if that machinery evolved for social communication rather than individual experience, then the experience of selfhood is, in a meaningful sense, a social product. The self that feels so intimate and private and fundamental is actually an interface layer produced by machinery that exists primarily for talking to other people. When you think in words, you are using your social communications system as a scratchpad. The inner voice is the voice you use to talk to others, redirected inward. And here the connection to the parasitic theory becomes interesting again. If the self is a social construct produced by linguistic machinery, then it may be doing work that is fundamentally relational rather than individual. It may be the cost you pay for being able to participate in the extraordinarily complex cooperative social reality that humans have built. The inner life is the price of admission to human society. Without it, you cannot take your place in the web of mutual modeling, expectation, and obligation that constitutes social existence. You cannot be trusted, because trust requires modeling another person's inner states. You cannot cooperate reliably, because reliability requires anticipating another person's reasoning. You cannot participate in culture, which is the collective construction of a shared inner world. The parasitic theory assumes that the proper comparison class for consciousness is individual survival. It compares the conscious human to the unconscious zombie and finds the human metabolically wanting. But if the human is not primarily an individual survival machine, but a node in a social network, then the comparison is wrong. The proper comparison is not conscious human versus unconscious human. It is conscious human embedded in a social network versus unconscious human embedded in a social network. And in that comparison, the conscious human may win decisively. Because the social network of cooperative, mutually modeling, linguistically communicating, culturally embedded conscious beings may generate survival advantages, so overwhelming that they more than compensate for the metabolic cost of the individual conscious minds that compose it. This is not just theoretical. The evidence of human dominance on this planet is precisely the evidence that social cognition, at scale, produces a kind of collective intelligence that individual efficiency cannot match. A single human is physically inferior to dozens of other animals. A single human cannot survive a winter without tools and shelter. A single human cannot bring down a large prey animal alone. But humans working in coordinated groups with shared knowledge and shared planning have reshaped the surface of the planet. They have eradicated diseases, redirected rivers, and built structure visible from space. The consciousness that seems inefficient at the individual level may be the very thing that makes the collective unstoppable. Part 7. What evolution cannot see. The parasitic theory of consciousness depends on a particular assumption about natural selection, that it optimizes at the level of the individual organism. If consciousness is costly to you and provides no benefit to you, natural selection should eliminate it from your genome over time. But natural selection does not always this way. It also operates at the level of genes, which may persist in a population even if they reduce the survival of the individual organism that carries them. And it can operate at the level of groups, selecting for traits that benefit the group even at cost to the individual. Kin selection, the principle by which organisms sometimes sacrifice their own reproductive fitness to benefit close genetic relatives, is a well-established mechanism by which costly individual traits can persist in a population. A worker bee sacrifices its own reproduction entirely to serve the hive. If individual optimization were all that mattered, the worker bee would never exist. But the worker bee's genes are preserved in the queen's offspring, and the hive's collective success vastly increases the representation of those genes in the next generation. The sacrifice makes sense at the level of the gene, even though it makes no sense at the level of the individual. Could consciousness be something similar? Could it be a costly individual trait that is maintained in the population because it benefits the group? The social intelligence hypothesis, outlined in the previous section, suggests that it could. Consciousness makes individuals more useful members of their social group. It enables the cooperative planning, mutual modeling, and cultural transmission that make human societies so powerful. A group made up of conscious, mutually modeling, linguistically sophisticated individuals may outcompete a group made up of simpler, more individually efficient beings, even if each individual conscious being is paying a higher metabolic price than it would if it were operating alone. Natural selection also cannot see very far forward. It optimizes for current conditions, not future ones. A trait that is currently marginally net negative in metabolic terms might be maintained in a population simply because the conditions under which it would be selected against have not yet arrived, or because it is genetically linked to other traits that are clearly beneficial, or because it exists in a regime of evolutionary stasis in which the selection pressure against it is too weak to overcome other forces. Evolution is not a perfect optimizer. It produces organisms that are good enough for their current environment, not optimal under all possible conditions. Consciousness may be a feature that evolution has not yet had the pressure or the time to properly evaluate. The timescale argument is important here. Human consciousness in its full form, including the linguistic inner world, the recursive self-modeling, the capacity for abstract philosophical reasoning about one's own existence, this is evolutionarily very recent. It is tens of thousands of years old at most, and in its full culturally elaborated form, probably only a few thousand years old. Natural selection working on features with effects this subtle, in a species with a long generation time, over this short a period, may simply not have had enough generations to do anything definitive. We may be in the middle of an evolutionary experiment that has not yet returned a verdict. This is a humbling thought. We like to think that our consciousness represents the high point of a long evolutionary ascent, the crown of creation, the apex of a purposive biological process. But evolution has no purpose and no direction. It is a blind optimization process operating with severe lag and limited information. The fact that we are here and conscious does not mean that consciousness was selected for. It might just mean that it has not been selected against hard enough yet. Unfair. Part 8. The recursive trap. There is a peculiar irony embedded in the parasitic theory of consciousness. The theory requires consciousness to evaluate itself. You cannot think your way to the conclusion that thinking is unnecessary. The very process by which you assess the value of consciousness, the gathering of evidence, the weighing of arguments, the construction of a narrative about what the evidence means, is itself a conscious process. The parasite is being asked to audit its own ledger. This recursion is not just a philosophical curiosity, it is a fundamental constraint on what the parasitic theory can establish. Even if every piece of evidence we have discussed points toward consciousness being epiphenomenal, the interpretation of that evidence, the construction of an argument from it, the decision to find the argument convincing, these are all things that consciousness is doing. And if consciousness can do all of that, if it can identify a pattern across experimental findings, from blindsight to split-brain research to the Libet experiments, and synthesize them into a coherent theoretical framework, then it is doing something that no unconscious system has yet demonstrably done. This is not a proof that consciousness is necessary. It is possible that an unconscious system could have generated this exact sequence of words without any accompanying experience. It is possible that you, reading this, are generating comprehension responses without any felt quality of understanding. It is possible the sense of a light going on in your head when an argument clicks is purely metaphorical, a behavioral marker with no experiential reality behind it. The zombie problem cuts both ways. We cannot verify that anyone else is conscious. We can only verify that we are. And even that verification is performed by the very system whose reliability we are questioning. What the recursion reveals is that the parasitic theory, while it draws on genuine empirical evidence and raises legitimate scientific and philosophical importance, cannot be its own conclusion. If consciousness were truly doing nothing, the parasitic theory would not have been formulated. No evolutionary pressure would have produced organisms capable of philosophical self-reflection. The ability to wonder whether your wondering is useful is itself a very strange and specific capability that requires explanation. Philosophical zombies do not wonder whether they are philosophical zombies. They cannot. The question requires an inner life to pose. This does not mean that consciousness is vindicated. It means that the question of its function is still genuinely open. It means that the things we can be most certain that consciousness is doing are precisely the things that are hardest to evaluate in survival terms. It generates the experience of meaning. It produces the sense that some things matter more than others. It constructs the narrative of a life that has direction and value and continuity. It is the machinery that asks why rather than just what. And the question of whether any of that is survival value is exactly the kind of question that only a consciousness capable of valuing things can even meaningfully ask. We are, in other words, the only kind of thing that can worry about whether it is worth worrying. That is either a profound evolutionary mistake or the most significant development in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth. The evidence does not yet tell us which. What it tells us is that the question is real, the cost is real, the uncertainty is real, and the fact that you are here, burning glucose to read this, unable to stop thinking about whether your thinking is for nothing, is itself the strangest and most costly and most bewildering piece of evidence in the case. Part the purpose makers. Yet, this trajectory does not necessarily mean that consciousness is destined to be erased by efficiency. There is a final and perhaps more generative way to frame everything we have examined. One that does not resolve the tension, but situates it differently. Consider what consciousness can do that nothing else can. not in terms of survival mechanics, not in terms of reflex speed or metabolic efficiency, but in terms of something rarer and harder to name. Consciousness can assign value. It can declare that something matters. It can look at the entirety of the blind machinery grinding through space and time and say, this particular configuration of matter is precious. This moment is worth preserving. This relationship is not just a social utility function. It is irreplaceable. No optimization process can do this. Natural selection is a blind optimizer. It produces outcomes but does not value them. The laws of physics describe what happens but do not prefer any outcome over another. The philosophical zombie navigates the room but does not care that it navigated the room. The universe without consciousness is a vast computation with no one to declare the result meaningful. Consciousness, whatever its metabolic cost, whatever its epiphenomenal ambiguity, is the only thing in the known universe that cares about what happens. It is the only thing that experiences the difference between a good outcome and a bad one, not just as a behavioral distinction, but as something that actually matters. This is not a small thing. It is arguably the most significant thing. If consciousness is the mechanism by which the universe comes to know itself, to experience itself, to evaluate itself, then its metabolic cost is not just an expense in the biological accounting. It is the price of the entire enterprise of meaning. Everything that we call civilization, art, justice, love, the project of science itself, the effort to understand from and what we are, these are not survival strategies. They are products of a kind of valuing that only consciousness makes possible. The zombie civilizations, the hyper-efficient unconscious intelligences that the parasitic theory predicts are waiting in our evolutionary future, will not mourn us. They cannot. They will not celebrate their own existence. They cannot. They will be, in a very precise and terrible sense, exactly as meaningful as the arrangement of sand on a shaped by wind. Perfect. Functional. Exquisitely organized, and without anyone there to declare it beautiful. This is why the question of whether consciousness is a parasite or a purpose cannot be decided by biology alone. Biology can tell us the cost. Philosophy and lived experience are the only tool we have for assessing the value of what we are getting in return. And the value is this: there is something it is like to be alive. There is a felt quality to this moment that will not have existed before and will not exist again in exactly this form. The light is on. Someone is home. The universe is not just happening, it is being witnessed. Whether that is worth 20% of your calories is perhaps the only question that genuinely matters. And the fact that you can ask it, that you can sit with the uncertainty of it, that you can feel the weight of not knowing the answer, is the very capacity whose value you are trying to assess. The self that wonders if it is worth having is the only kind of self there is. And that circularity, that impossibility of standing outside your own consciousness to evaluate it, is not a flaw in the inquiry. It is the most honest thing about it. Conscious beings, through their unique capacity for self-reflection, can actively shape the development of the zombie-like systems they are building. They can use their costly awareness to define what better means, to specify what optimization should be aimed at, to decide which futures are worth running toward. The zombie may run perfectly, but only the conscious can decide what it is running toward. And in a universe that will otherwise run blindly and brilliantly toward nothing in particular, that might be the most important job of all.